Some bodies tell you exactly how they died, and others lie to you from the moment you pull them from the water. I'm Vincent Rodriguez, and I've been a dive recovery specialist with the Oregon State Police for 8 years. I've pulled everything from suicide jumpers to accident victims out of lakes, rivers, and reservoirs across the state. You learn to read the water, to understand how currents move, and where bodies settle. The water doesn't lie until Crater Lake proved me wrong. It was early October when we got the call about Marcus Hoffman, a 32-year-old photographer from Portland who'd been camping alone at the rim. Park rangers found his gear still set up, camera equipment worth thousands just sitting there, but no sign of Marcus. His rental car keys were in his tent. His wallet was in his backpack. Everything suggested he'd planned to return. The initial search focused on the hiking trails around the rim, but after 2 days with no trace, the incident commander requested dive support. Crater Lake sits in the caldera of an ancient volcano, nearly 2,000 feet deep in places, with water so clear you can see 100 feet down on a good day. If Marcus had fallen or jumped, the depth meant recovery, not rescue. I drove up from Salem with my partner Dana Walsh, loaded with standard recovery equipment. The lake was glass smooth that morning, reflecting the October sky like a perfect mirror. Dana had been diving these waters longer than anyone on the team, and she briefed me on the particulars during our equipment check. No significant currents in the main body of the lake. Water temperature dropped fast with depth. Visibility excellent, but the bottom was mostly unmapped beyond the known geological surveys. Thing about Crater Lake, Dana said, adjusting her regulator, is it's basically a giant bowl. No inflow, no outflow, except evaporation and precipitation. Water just sits there, has for thousands of years. Bodies don't travel far. We started our search pattern at dawn, working grid coordinates provided by the Coast Guard based on wind patterns and the most likely entry points from the rim. The water was so clear, it felt like diving through air. Massive walls of volcanic rock dropping away into blue-black depths that seemed to go on forever. 3 hours into the search, Dana's voice crackled through the comm system. "I've got something. Northeast of Wizard Island, about 60 feet down." I followed her marker buoy and found her hovering over what was definitely a body. Male, approximately the right height and build for Marcus Hoffman, wearing the clothes described by park rangers. But something was wrong with the position. The body was oriented head down toward the lake bottom, arms spread wide, perfectly vertical in the water column. No current to speak of, yet the body hung there as if suspended, not settled on the bottom or floating toward the surface. When I checked my depth gauge, it read 78 feet. Dana's position showed 62 feet. We were looking at the same body from the same relative position. "Dana, what's your depth reading?" 62 feet. "You?" 78. We surfaced to recalibrate our equipment. Both dive computers showed different readings, but our backup analog gauges confirmed the electronic readings were accurate. Somehow, we'd been at different depths while observing the same object in the same location. "Equipment malfunction," Dana said, but her voice carried doubt. "Let's try again." Our second dive revealed something more disturbing. The body had moved. Not drifted, moved. It now rested on what appeared to be a rocky ledge that hadn't been there during our first descent. The geological formation looked ancient, carved volcanic rock covered in what might have been algae or sediment, but the water was too clear and cold to support significant plant growth. I photographed everything, taking special care to document the rock formation and the body's position relative to it. When I checked my depth gauge, it showed 112 feet. Dana, swimming directly beside me, showed 89 feet. The depth differential had increased. As we worked to secure the body for recovery, I noticed something that made my stomach clench. The clothing was wrong. Marcus Hoffman had been wearing a red flannel shirt, according to the park rangers. The body we'd found wore a gray wool sweater. The pants were different too, canvas work pants instead of the jeans described in the missing person report. "Dana, this isn't our guy," She turned to look at me through her mask, and I could see confusion in her eyes. Through the comm system, her voice was tight. "What do you mean? This is exactly where I marked the body. Look at the clothes. This isn't Marcus Hoffman." But when Dana turned back to the body, she shook her head. "Red flannel shirt, blue jeans, matches the description perfectly." I was looking at gray wool and canvas. She was seeing red flannel and denim. We were staring at the same body and seeing different things. We aborted the dive immediately. Back on the surface, I reviewed the underwater photographs on my camera's display. The images showed the body in a red flannel shirt and jeans, exactly as Dana had described. But I knew what I'd seen down there. I remembered the texture of the wool, the way the gray fabric moved in the gentle current that shouldn't have existed. "We need to report this," I told Dana, but she was already on the radio with Incident Command, confirming successful location of Marcus Hoffman's body and requesting recovery support. The recovery went smoothly. The body that came up was definitely Marcus Hoffman, identified by personal effects, and later confirmed by dental records. Red flannel shirt, blue jeans, exactly as described. Cause of death was determined to be drowning, manner undetermined. Could have been accident, could have been suicide. The case was closed within a week, but I couldn't let go of what I'd seen during that dive. That night, I pulled the geological survey maps. Dana had mentioned detailed underwater topography charts from 1987, the most recent comprehensive mapping of the lake bottom. The rock ledge where we'd found the body didn't exist on any map. I spent hours comparing my dive computer data with the survey charts. According to the maps, the area where we'd recovered Marcus Hoffman was open water over a gradually sloping bottom that didn't level out until nearly 300 feet down. No ledges, no rock formations, certainly nothing substantial enough to support a body. The next morning, I drove back to Crater Lake alone. I needed to dive that spot again, to photograph the rock formation and compare it with the geological surveys. If there was an unmapped ledge down there, it represented a significant navigational hazard for future dive operations. The water was rough that day, wind chopped and gray under an overcast sky. I had to wait until afternoon for conditions to improve enough for a solo dive. When I finally descended to the recovery site, my depth gauge showed normal readings 62 feet to the approximate location where we'd found the body. There was no rock ledge. The bottom sloped away into darkness exactly as the geological surveys indicated. No formation, no algae-covered surfaces, nothing but the smooth volcanic rock and sediment that characterized the rest of the lake bottom. I spent 40 minutes searching the area, expanding my pattern in ever-widening circles. My dive computer recorded a maximum depth of 68 feet. According to the device, I never went deeper than 70 feet during the entire dive. When I surfaced, I checked the data against my written notes from the recovery dive. During the recovery, my computer had recorded depths of 78 feet, then 112 feet, at the exact same GPS coordinates, where I'd just maxed out at 68 feet. That evening, I called Dana to discuss the discrepancies. She listened patiently while I explained about the rock ledge and the depth readings. But her responses were professional and detached. "Equipment malfunction," she said, "happens more than you'd think in deep water. Pressure changes can affect the sensors." "What about the rock formation? You saw it too." There was a long pause. "Vincent, I think you should take some time off. The recovery was clean, the case is closed. Sometimes we see things down there that aren't really there. It's part of the job." But Dana had been there. She'd seen the same ledge, the same impossible depths. Now she was talking like it had never happened. I requested the dive footage from our helmet cameras. The department's digital archive showed that our camera systems had malfunctioned during the recovery dive, recording only static and distorted images. Both cameras had failed simultaneously at depth, a malfunction that had somehow escaped our notice during the dive itself. 3 weeks later, I was transferred to the Portland dive team. My supervisor cited my request for additional investigation into a closed case as evidence that I needed a change of scenery. The transfer was presented as a promotion, but I knew better. I still dive recovery operations across Oregon. I've pulled bodies from the Columbia River, from mountain lakes, from flooded quarries and retention ponds. The water doesn't lie to me anymore. It tells me exactly what happened, exactly where to look, exactly how long they've been down. But I've never been back to Crater Lake. When operations there require dive support, other teams respond. My supervisor says it's about resource allocation and logistics, but the dive logs show a pattern. No one who worked the Marcus Hoffman recovery has been assigned to Crater Lake since. Last month, I ran into Dana at a training conference in Eugene. She looked older, tired around the eyes, and when I mentioned Crater Lake, she just shook her head. "That place isn't right," she said quietly. "Something about the depth, the way the water sits there, no flow, no current. Sometimes I think it's not really water at all down there. Sometimes I think it's something else that just looks like water." Then she walked away, and I haven't seen her since. I keep Marcus Hoffman's case file in my personal records, along with printouts of the geological surveys and copies of my dive computer data. The depth readings still don't match the known topography. The rock ledge still doesn't appear on any official map. But sometimes, late at night when I'm reviewing dive logs, I wonder if Marcus Hoffman was really the body we brought up from Crater Lake. I wonder about the gray wool sweater I saw, about the man who should have been wearing it, about how long he might have been suspended in that impossible depth, waiting for someone to find him in a place that doesn't exist on any map. The water doesn't lie, except when it does. Water doesn't lie about temperature, but Blue Spring taught me that some truths are colder than physics allows. I'm Nicole Harper, and I've been a dive recovery specialist with the Marion County Sheriff's Office for 6 years. Florida's springs are my specialty crystal clear limestone caverns that can kill you in a dozen different ways if you don't respect them. Cave diving is technical work that requires precision and equipment that functions exactly as designed. When gear starts failing in predictable patterns, there's always a reason. Blue Spring sits in the Ocala National Forest, pumping 72 million gallons daily from the Floridan aquifer. The water maintains a constant 72 degrees year-round, warm enough for comfortable diving even in winter. It's a popular training site because of the stable conditions and excellent visibility. That's why the emergency call didn't make sense. We've got 3 divers with hypothermia symptoms at Blue Spring. Dispatch crackled through my radio on a Tuesday morning in March. EMTs are on scene, requesting dive team support for equipment recovery. Hypothermia in Florida springs happens, but rarely. Usually it's inexperienced divers who stay down too long. But 3 divers in one day suggested either serious mistakes or equipment failure. I arrived to find EMTs treating 2 men and a woman in their 30s, all experienced divers with high-end gear. They were conscious but shivering uncontrollably, core temperatures between 94 and 96 degrees. "How long were you down?" I asked the first diver, Tom Hartley, who ran a dive shop in Gainesville. 28 minutes, he said through chattering teeth. Standard cavern dive. Stayed in the daylight zone. Never went below 50 feet. His dive computer confirmed it. 28 minutes, maximum depth 47 feet. Water temperature 72 degrees throughout. No reason for hypothermia. The second diver, Rebecca Moss, showed similar readings. But she was shaking so violently the EMTs had wrapped her in emergency blankets. The water felt normal when we descended, but about 15 minutes in, it was like swimming through ice water. The third diver, James Liu, was the most disturbing case. His core temperature had dropped to 93 degrees, but he kept insisting his dive had been longer and deeper than his computer indicated. I was down there for over an hour, went way back into the cave system, deeper than I've ever been, But my computer says 26 minutes, maximum depth 38 feet. I interviewed Carl Brennan, the local cave diving instructor leading orientation dives that morning. Carl had been teaching at Blue Spring for 12 years. "This is the third incident this month," he admitted quietly. "Always the same pattern. Experienced divers, proper gear, normal dive profiles, but they surface with hypothermia and stories that don't match their recorded data." "What kind of stories?" "Deep penetration dives into restricted areas that don't exist. Detailed descriptions of passages not on any survey map. And they all mention the cold water, so cold it should have been ice, but stayed liquid." I decided to investigate with thermal imaging to map temperature variations throughout the cave system. Thermal anomalies could explain the hypothermia cases. The spring looked normal from the surface, crystal clear water revealing the limestone cave entrance, bright sand bottom, the familiar hourglass shape extending toward the St. John's River. I descended slowly, monitoring my dive computer and thermal imaging system. At 30 feet, the thermal camera revealed something impossible. Scattered throughout the water were pockets registering below freezing, some as cold as 28 degrees, while maintaining perfect liquid state. The pockets appeared as randomly distributed volumes of supercooled water that should have been ice. I swam closer to one cold pocket, roughly spherical and 3 feet in diameter near the cave entrance. When I extended my hand into it, the cold was instant and brutal, like plunging into liquid nitrogen. My wetsuit provided no protection. The cold went straight through the neoprene into my bones. I jerked back and checked the thermal camera. The cold pocket had moved, not drifted, moved deliberately, relocating while maintaining its shape and temperature. More cold pockets appeared throughout my field of view, dozens of them at various depths, each one impossible water registering below freezing while remaining liquid. They moved independently, some rising, others sinking, all maintaining perfect shapes that defied physics. I tried filming with my underwater camera, but standard lens showed only normal spring water. The thermal system detected cold pockets clearly, but they were invisible to regular photography. On camera, I appeared to be reacting to nothing. My dive computer began malfunctioning as I approached the cave entrance. Depth readings flickered between 42 feet and impossible numbers over 200 feet in a spring system only 50 feet deep at maximum. Water temperature alternated between 72 degrees and error messages. Following the cave line into the entrance, staying within the daylight zone, the thermal camera revealed massive concentrations of cold pockets deeper in the system. But something else appeared on the display: heat signatures that looked like human forms, moving through the deepest parts where no divers should have been able to go. The signatures showed normal human body temperature, bright white against cold water, but diving in areas extending beyond known cave boundaries. I counted 6 human heat signatures moving through impossible spaces, following what appeared to be a guided dive pattern through chambers that didn't exist. One heat signature turned toward me. Through thermal imaging, I could see a diver in full cave gear, complete with helmet lights and gas bottles. The figure looked in my direction, even raised what appeared to be a hand in greeting. I switched between thermal and normal vision. In thermal, the diver was clearly visible 60 feet into the cave. Through my mask, looking at the same location, nothing but empty water and limestone wall. The impossible diver began moving toward me, maintaining perfect buoyancy as it navigated through thermal cold pockets. According to the camera, it swam through water registering negative 15 degrees, but showed no signs of hypothermia. As it approached, my own body temperature began dropping rapidly. The cold wasn't from surrounding water, it radiated from the approaching heat signature. Despite thermal readings showing normal human temperature, my wetsuit felt like it was conducting cold rather than insulating. I tried backing toward the cave entrance, but the cold followed. My hands went numb inside gloves. Breathing became labored as core temperature dropped. The regulator felt like it delivered ice water with each breath. The thermal signature stopped 10 feet away and remained stationary. Through thermal imaging, a perfectly normal diver. Through normal vision, nothing except a growing patch of water that looked darker than surrounding spring water, like a shadow cast from below. My dive computer alarm sounded. Core temperature warning. Hypothermia alert. But water temperature remained 72 degrees. I began ascent, following proper procedures despite equipment warnings and growing cold. The thermal camera showed all 6 impossible divers following, maintaining distance but tracking my movement. They followed to the 30-foot stop where they remained stationary while I completed ascent. Breaking the surface, Carl Brennan waited at the dock with obvious concern. How long was I down? 43 minutes. You were supposed to be back 20 minutes ago. My dive computer showed 26 minutes, maximum depth 38 feet. The thermal system logged 43 minutes, including readings from depths exceeding 100 feet. Carl helped me from the water. I was shivering uncontrollably despite feeling the dive had been normal temperature. Core temperature registered 94 degrees. Did you see anything unusual? Carl asked quietly. I told him about the thermal signatures, impossible divers, cold pockets below freezing but liquid. He listened without interruption, nodding as if he'd heard similar accounts. The 3 divers from this morning described encounters with other divers in the deep cave system. Divers exploring areas that don't exist, on longer, deeper dives than the cave allows. I submitted my report focusing on equipment malfunctions and thermal anomalies, recommending Blue Spring be temporarily closed until temperature irregularities could be investigated. The thermal imaging data was filed as evidence, though I never included footage of impossible heat signatures. 3 weeks later, Blue Spring reopened. According to the State Environmental Agency, extensive monitoring revealed no anomalies. The hypothermia cases were attributed to equipment failure and diver error. But Carl quietly stopped teaching at Blue Spring. When I asked why, he told me thermal signatures had started appearing on the surface human-shaped heat sources standing on the dock at night, looking down into the water as if planning their next dive. I transferred to river systems in North Florida. I still dive caves, but never Blue Spring. When operations there require technical support, other teams respond. The water temperature at Blue Spring remains 72 degrees. The cave extends only 50 feet to its deepest point. But somewhere in that spring, divers are exploring chambers that don't exist, breathing water that should be frozen, following dive plans that lead to places no one should be able to go. Your reflection is supposed to follow you, not lead you into places you've never been. I'm Trevor Nguyen, and I've been a dive recovery officer with the New York State Police for 4 years. My beat covers the Finger Lakes region, where deep glacial lakes hide everything from suicide victims to evidence from decades-old crimes. Seneca Lake is the deepest of them all, dropping 618 feet at its maximum depth, cold and dark enough to preserve things that should have decomposed years ago. Most of my work involves routine evidence, recovery weapons thrown from bridges, stolen vehicles pushed through ice, personal effects that might help close cases that have gone cold. It's methodical work that requires patience and attention to detail. The water doesn't give up its secrets easily, but it always tells the truth eventually. The Lake Patrol Office sits on the eastern shore near Geneva, a small building that serves as headquarters for marine enforcement across the northern Finger Lakes. My supervisor, Ashley Morse, has been working these waters for 15 years. She knows every boat ramp, every dangerous current, every place where the lake bottom drops away into darkness that swallows searchlights. We've got a request for evidence recovery at the south end, Ashley told me on a gray morning in late October. State investigators think there might be a weapon dump site about 40 feet down near the old boat launch at Sampson State Park. Anonymous tip came in yesterday. Anonymous tips about weapon dumps usually mean someone's conscience finally caught up with them, or they're trying to eliminate evidence that could tie them to something serious. Either way, it was worth checking out. I loaded my gear into the patrol boat and headed south down the lake. The water was glass smooth that morning, reflecting the overcast sky like a perfect mirror. October in the Finger Lakes means the summer boat traffic has died down, leaving the water quiet except for the occasional fishing boat or waterfowl. The coordinates put me in about 60 feet of water, just off a rocky point that had been a popular swimming area before the state park closed that section to the public. I anchored the boat and began my equipment check, standard procedure for any solo dive in deep water. The underwater camera was part of my standard kit, a high-definition unit designed to document evidence recovery for court purposes. Every dive got recorded, every piece of evidence photographed in place before recovery. The footage had been crucial in several major cases, providing visual proof of where items were found and how they'd been positioned underwater. I descended slowly, following the anchor line to the bottom. Visibility was good for Seneca Lake, in autumn about 30 feet, with the water temperature around 50 degrees. My dive light revealed the typical lake bottom: silt, scattered rocks, the occasional beer can or fishing lure lost by careless anglers. 20 minutes into the dive, I found what the anonymous tipster had described: a canvas bag, military surplus by the look of it, weighted down with what felt like concrete blocks. The bag was partially buried in silt, but I could see the outline of multiple objects inside the right size and shape for handguns. I began documenting the find with the underwater camera, taking wide shots to establish the location and close-ups to show details. Standard evidence, photography, everything by the book. The bag would go to the crime lab for processing, and if we were lucky, ballistics might match the weapons to unsolved cases. As I worked, I became aware of movement above me. Through the water, I could see the dark outline of my patrol boat on the surface, but there was something else, a shadow moving near the boat that looked like another diver. I checked my watch and depth gauge. I'd been down for 25 minutes at 42 feet, well within safe limits for a solo dive. No other boats were scheduled in the area, and Ashley hadn't mentioned sending backup support. I aimed the camera toward the surface and started recording. Through the viewfinder, I could clearly see my patrol boat floating overhead, its hull dark against the gray sky, visible through the water. But there was definitely something else moving near the boat, a human-shaped shadow that appeared to be diving or swimming just below the surface. The shadow was moving in a coordinated pattern, like someone conducting a search. It would descend to what looked like 20 feet, move in a grid pattern, then surface and move to a new position. Professional dive behavior, but there was no one else authorized to be in the water. I surfaced to check on the situation, breaking through 40 feet above to find the lake surface completely empty except for my own boat. No other divers, no other vessels, nothing that could have cast the shadow I'd observed from below. Marine Patrol to dispatch, I radioed. Can you confirm if there are any other dive operations scheduled for Seneca Lake today? Negative, Marine Patrol. You're the only authorized dive operation on the lake today. I treaded water next to my boat, scanning the surface in all directions. The lake was empty, but I was certain I'd seen another diver from below. I climbed back into the boat and reviewed the underwater camera footage on the camera's small display screen. The footage clearly showed my patrol boat from underwater, but there was no sign of the shadow I'd observed. The camera had recorded clear water and empty surface, no indication of another diver or any movement near the boat. I decided to complete the evidence recovery and review the footage more carefully back at the office. I descended again to the weapon dump site, secured the canvas bag to my lifting bag, and began the ascent. Standard procedure, everything by the book. But as I rose through the water column, the underwater camera captured something that made my blood run cold. In the footage, looking up toward the surface from 30 feet down, I could see my own reflection clearly visible on the lake surface above me. The reflection showed me ascending through the water, just as I was actually doing. But the reflection was also showing me diving in a completely different area of the lake. I was looking at two versions of myself on the surface. One reflection showed me ascending with the evidence bag, exactly matching my actual position and movements. The other reflection showed me conducting a dive pattern in an area of the lake where I'd never been, searching the bottom in grid patterns near what looked like the old pier ruins on the north shore. I stopped my ascent and watched through the camera viewfinder. The second reflection was moving independently, diving to depths and exploring areas while I remained stationary at 30 feet. It was wearing my gear, using my equipment, following proper dive protocols, but it was somewhere else entirely. I tried signaling to the surface with my dive light, flashing the beam in a standard emergency pattern. Through the camera, I watched one of my reflections respond appropriately, flashing a light back from directly overhead. The other reflection continued its independent dive pattern, showing no reaction to my signals. When I finally surfaced with the evidence bag, Ashley was waiting in a department boat about 100 yards away. "How long was I down?" I asked her as she helped me load the evidence bag. 42 minutes total. But Trevor, I need to ask you something. We had a report from a fishing boat that they saw you diving near the old pier ruins about 20 minutes ago. But according to your dive plan, you were supposed to be working the south end near Sampson Park. I never left the evidence site. I've been working the same area for the entire dive. Ashley looked uncomfortable. The fishermen were pretty specific. They said they watched you surface near the pier ruins, wave to them, then descend again. Professional dive behavior, proper safety protocols. They assumed you were working a second site. I told her about the camera footage, about seeing two reflections on the surface showing different dive operations. She listened without interruption, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. Back at the office, we reviewed the underwater camera footage together. The digital file clearly showed the moment I'd observed two distinct reflections of me on the lake surface, one matching my actual position and movements, the other conducting an independent dive operation in a different area. "Equipment malfunction," Ashley said finally. "Digital cameras can create weird artifacts, especially underwater. Double exposures, image ghosting, that kind of thing. But the footage was too clear, too detailed to be a technical glitch. Both reflections showed proper dive technique, appropriate safety procedures, even the correct equipment configuration. One of them was me. The other was something else that looked exactly like me, diving in places I'd never been. We filed the evidence recovery report, and the weapons in the canvas bag eventually helped close 3 homicide cases dating back to 2015. Successful operation, textbook evidence recovery. But I started paying attention to reports of dive operations on Seneca Lake, especially in areas where I hadn't been working. Over the next month, there were 6 separate reports of a state police diver working various sites around the lake. Always professional behavior, always following proper protocols, always in areas where I wasn't scheduled to be. Ashley stopped assigning me solo dive operations on Seneca Lake. When I asked why, she told me that witnesses were reporting seeing me in multiple locations simultaneously, and it was creating confusion about our operational procedures. "Maybe it's time you took some leave," she suggested. "Get some rest. Clear your head. Deep water diving can play tricks on your mind." I transferred to the Canandaigua Lake Patrol District 3 weeks later. Smaller lake, shallower water, fewer opportunities for the kind of deep dive operations that Seneca Lake requires. But sometimes, when I'm working recovery operations in other lakes, I wonder about my reflection on Seneca Lake. I wonder if it's still down there, conducting search patterns in areas I've never explored, following dive plans I never made, looking for evidence in places I'll never go. The underwater camera footage is still in the department's digital archive, 42 minutes of video that shows 2 versions of me working the same lake at the same time. Technical glitch, according to the official report. But reflections aren't supposed to have their own agenda, and they're not supposed to dive in water you've never touched. There are places in Caddo Lake where sound goes to die, and once you've been there, silence follows you home. I'm Carla Reeves, and I've been leading dive recovery operations for the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department for 9 years. Caddo Lake sits on the border between Texas and Louisiana. 25,000 acres of cypress swamps, bayous, and open water that can hide anything from sunken boats to bodies that disappear into the tannic water and never surface again. The lake is maze-like, with hundreds of channels winding between ancient cypress trees draped in Spanish moss. Water levels fluctuate with rainfall and dam releases, creating new passages and closing others. It's easy to get lost even with GPS, and the dark water can be 15 feet deep in one spot and 3 feet deep 10 yards away. Most of my work involves routine recovery operations, boats that hit stumps and sink, fishing equipment lost in the cypress roots, occasionally a drowning victim whose body settles in the deeper channels. The water is stained dark brown, with tannins from decomposing vegetation, limiting visibility to maybe 3 feet on a good day. You work by feel as much as sight, following guidelines and trusting your equipment. The Parks and Wildlife Office in Marshall handles law enforcement and rescue operations for the entire lake system. My team responds to everything from boating accidents to evidence recovery for the sheriff's departments on both sides of the state line. It's specialized work that requires patience and technical skills most officers don't have. We've been getting strange reports from the north end of the lake. My supervisor, Janet Hayes, told me on a humid morning in August. Multiple complaints about communication equipment failing in specific areas. Boat radios, fish finders, even cell phones going dead when people cross certain sections of water. Electronic equipment failure wasn't unusual on Caddo Lake. The high humidity and frequent thunderstorms played havoc with sensitive electronics. But Janet's description suggested a pattern that was worth investigating. The reports are coming from the same coordinates, she continued. Several areas near Big Green Break where boats are experiencing total communication blackouts. No radio, no GPS, no sonar. Everything goes silent when they enter these zones. I loaded my gear into the department boat and headed north toward Big Green Break, a section of the lake dominated by massive cypress trees and narrow channels that could barely accommodate a small boat. The water was still that morning, reflecting the canopy of Spanish moss like a dark mirror. My first stop was to interview Frank Solomon, a local fishing guide who'd been working Caddo Lake for 30 years. Frank knew every channel, every stump, every place where the fish like to hide during different seasons. If anyone understood what was happening in the north end, it would be him. I found Frank at the boat launch near Uncertain, Texas, preparing for a guided fishing trip. He was a weathered man in his 60s who spoke with the slow cadence of someone who'd spent his life on the water. Those dead zones started showing up about 2 months ago, he told me. First time I noticed it, my fish finder went completely black when I crossed this one spot near the big cypress stand. No depth reading, no fish marks, nothing. Thought it was equipment failure. How many areas are we talking about? At least 6 that I've found so far, maybe more. They're perfect circles, each one about 50 yards across. When you enter them, everything goes quiet. And I mean everything. Your engine sounds muffled, your radio goes dead, even the fish stop biting. Frank described the locations in detail, using landmarks that made sense to someone who knew the lake intimately. Ancient cypress trees, distinctive stumps, the shape of distant tree lines. I marked the coordinates on my GPS and prepared to investigate. One more thing, Frank said as I prepared to leave. The fish won't go near those areas. I've been watching them on my sonar, and they swim right up to the edge of those circles and turn away, like they hit an invisible wall. The first dead zone was located near a stand of massive cypress trees whose roots created a natural channel through the swamp. As I approached the coordinates Frank had provided, my boat's engine began sounding different, muffled, as if the exhaust was being absorbed by something in the air. When I crossed into the zone, the change was immediate and disturbing. My marine radio went completely silent, not just losing signal but producing no sound at all when I keyed the microphone. The GPS display went black. My fish finder showed nothing but empty screen. But the most unsettling change was the complete absence of ambient sound. No water lapping against the hull, no engine noise despite the motor running normally, no bird calls from the cypress trees. It was as if I'd entered a bubble where sound simply couldn't exist. I tried shouting to test my voice. I could feel my vocal cords vibrating, feel the air moving through my throat, but no sound emerged. My voice had been completely absorbed by whatever was affecting this area of the lake. I marked the zone's boundaries using visual landmarks and prepared to investigate underwater. If there was something on the lake bottom causing the audio interference, dive investigation was the only way to find it. Descending into the dark water of Caddo Lake always felt like entering another world. Visibility was limited to arm's length, and navigation relied entirely on following guidelines and trusting your compass. But as I descended into the dead zone, I realized something was fundamentally wrong with the underwater environment. My breathing apparatus made no sound. The bubbles rising from my regulator were completely silent, creating the surreal experience of breathing underwater without any audio feedback. I could feel the bubbles against my face mask, see them rising through the tannin-stained water, but they produced no sound whatsoever. The underwater communication system I used to stay in contact with surface support was completely dead. No static, no interference, just absolute silence. Even my depth gauge alarm, which should have beeped when I reached 20 feet, produced no sound. I followed my guideline deeper into the dead zone, using a waterproof flashlight to navigate through the cypress roots and submerged logs that littered the bottom. At about 15 feet, I encountered something that made my blood run cold. The lake bottom in the dead zone was perfectly circular and completely devoid of the organic debris that covered the rest of Caddo Lake. No fallen logs, no cypress knees, no accumulated sediment, just smooth, dark substrate that seemed to absorb my flashlight beam rather than reflect it. As I moved across this sterile bottom, I realized that my fins weren't creating the usual clouds of disturbed sediment. The material seemed to absorb movement, absorbing the energy from my swimming motions and leaving the water completely undisturbed. I tried tapping my dive knife against a piece of equipment to create sound. The vibrations traveled through the metal, but no acoustic signal emerged. It was as if the water itself had become a perfect sound dampener, absorbing every form of audio energy. But the most disturbing discovery came when I looked up toward the surface. Through the dark water, I could see the hull of my boat overhead, but something was wrong with the shape. The boat appeared to be distorted, stretched and compressed in ways that defied physics. The image wavered and shifted, as if I was looking at it through a lens that was constantly changing focal length. I began my ascent, following proper decompression procedures despite the shallow depth. As I rose through the water column, I could feel pressure changes that didn't match my depth gauge. It was as if the water itself was denser in some areas and thinner in others, creating pockets of varying pressure that shouldn't exist. When I broke the surface, the silence continued. I could see my boat floating nearby, engine still running but producing no sound. The cypress trees swayed in a breeze I couldn't hear. Water dripped from my wetsuit in complete silence. I swam to my boat and climbed aboard, removing my diving gear in the eerie quiet. When I tried to start the engine, it responded normally. I could see the exhaust bubbles, feel the vibration through the hull, but it made no sound at all. As I prepared to leave the dead zone, I noticed something that nearly made me panic. On the surface of the water around my boat, there were perfect concentric circles spreading outward, as if something large had surfaced nearby. But I had seen nothing break the surface, heard nothing that could have created such disturbances. The circles continued to appear at regular intervals, each one larger than the last, as if something beneath the water was creating them systematically. But the source remained invisible, and in the absolute silence of the dead zone, there was no way to determine what was causing the phenomenon. I gunned my engine and headed for the edge of the zone. The moment I crossed the boundary, sound returned like a physical blow. Engine noise, water sounds, bird calls from the cypress trees, everything came back at once with startling intensity after the complete silence. I immediately radioed my position to Janet and reported the dead zone phenomenon. Her voice crackled back clearly, but when I described what I'd experienced, there was a long pause before she responded. "Carla, are you sure about this? Complete audio failure over a specific geographic area? That's not possible from a physics standpoint." But my equipment logs confirmed everything. GPS blackout at specific coordinates, communication failure lasting exactly 18 minutes, depth readings that didn't match known lake bathymetry. The data was there, even if it defied explanation. Over the next week, I investigated 4 more dead zones scattered across the north end of Caddo Lake. Each one showed the same characteristics: perfect circles of audio absorption, equipment failure, and underwater environments that seemed to defy normal physics. Frank Solomon stopped taking guided trips to the north end of the lake. When I asked him why, he told me that clients were complaining about the silence, saying it made them feel like they were being watched by something they couldn't hear approaching. I submitted my report, recommending that the dead zones be marked as navigation hazards and closed to recreational boating until the phenomenon could be investigated by acoustic specialists. But no specialists ever came, and the zones weren't marked on any official charts. 3 months later, I was transferred to lake operations in East Texas. Janet said it was a promotion, but I knew better. The dead zones of Caddo Lake had become classified as unexplained phenomena, filed away in reports that would never see public review. I still work lake enforcement, but I've never encountered anything like the silent zones of Caddo Lake. Sometimes, in the quiet moments before dawn when I'm preparing for a dive, I remember the absolute silence of those dead zones and wonder what creates places where sound cannot exist. The audio doesn't lie about what's in the water, except when there's no audio at all. And in those places, silence itself becomes something you can feel watching you. Something that follows you home in the quiet spaces between sounds, waiting for the right moment to swallow everything you thought you could trust about the world above and below the surface. Some wrecks stay where they sink, and others follow currents that don't exist on any chart. I'm Blake Castillo, and I've been a dive recovery officer with the Minnesota State Patrol for 7 years. Lake Superior is my jurisdiction, 350 miles of the most dangerous freshwater in North America. The lake is cold enough to preserve bodies for decades, and deep enough to hide ships that vanished without a trace. When something goes down in Superior, it usually stays down. The lake kills with cold and storms that can appear in minutes, turning calm water into 30-foot seas that swallow vessels whole. November is the worst month, when gales sweep down from Canada and the water temperature drops toward freezing. It's the season when experienced captains stay in port and search and rescue operations become recovery missions. My office covers the Minnesota shore from Duluth to Grand Portage, responding to everything from recreational boating accidents to commercial vessel emergencies. Most of my dive work involves body recovery or evidence retrieval in water so cold it requires dry suits and surface-supplied air systems. The lake doesn't give up its dead easily, but it preserves them perfectly in the near-freezing depths. We've got a confirmed aircraft wreck about 12 miles northeast of Grand Marais, my supervisor, Captain Morris, told me on a gray morning in early November. Coast Guard spotted it on sonar yesterday during a routine patrol. Twin-engine aircraft. Looks like it's been down for a while. Aircraft crashes in Lake Superior were rare but not unheard of. Small planes occasionally went down in bad weather, usually with fatal results for anyone aboard. The lake was too cold for survival beyond a few minutes, and the depth made immediate rescue impossible. Any recent aircraft reported missing? I asked. That's the strange part. Coast Guard checked with the FAA, and there are no outstanding missing aircraft reports for this area. Nothing in the past 6 months that matches the sonar signature. I loaded my gear and headed out on the patrol boat with my dive partner Mike Chen and surface support technician Lisa Park. The coordinates put us in about 200 feet of water, well within technical diving limits but requiring careful planning for the depth and cold water conditions. Coast Guard Coordinator Elena Santos met us at the site with detailed sonar imagery. The wreck showed clearly on the bottom profiler a twin-engine aircraft, approximately 40 feet long, resting upright on the lakebed with its nose pointing northeast toward the Canadian shore. The strange thing is how intact it looks, Elena explained, pointing to the sonar display. Most aircraft that crash in water break apart on impact. This one appears to have made some kind of controlled descent. The sonar image showed an aircraft that appeared to be a 1962 era twin-engine design, possibly a corporate or charter plane. The wings were intact, the fuselage showed no obvious structural damage, and the aircraft sat level on the bottom, as if it had simply settled there. I suited up for the initial survey dive, using a dry suit and mixed gas system for the depth. Lake Superior in November was 38 degrees at the surface, dropping to near freezing at depth. The descent was routine until I reached the wreck at 180 feet. The aircraft was exactly as Elena's sonar had indicated, a Beechcraft Baron in remarkably good condition for a freshwater wreck. The registration numbers were clearly visible, N7439D. But something bothered me about the wreck's position. The plane sat on a section of lakebed that appeared to be loose sediment rather than the typical clay and rock bottom of Superior's depths. I documented the wreck with underwater photography and noticed that the aircraft wasn't settled into the bottom the way long-term wrecks usually are. There was minimal sediment accumulation around the landing gear, and the plane seemed to rest on top of the bottom rather than being partially buried by decades of silt deposition. When I researched the registration number, the results were disturbing. N7439D had been a charter aircraft that disappeared over Lake Superior on November 15, 1978, during a flight from Duluth to Thunder Bay. 2 people aboard, both presumed dead. Despite extensive searches, the wreck had never been located. 45 years, Elena said when I showed her the registration data. That plane has been missing for 45 years. 3 days later, Elena called with news that changed everything. Blake, we need you to re-dive that wreck site. Our routine sonar survey this morning shows the aircraft has moved. What do you mean, moved? It's now approximately 400 yards southwest of the original position. Same depth, same general area, but definitely a different location. That was impossible. Aircraft don't migrate across lake beds, especially not in the relatively calm conditions Superior had experienced over the past few days. But Elena's sonar data was clear. The wreck signature was in a completely different location. When I descended to the new coordinates, I found N7439D, exactly where the sonar indicated. Same aircraft, same condition, but now resting on a different section of lakebed. The nose was pointing northwest instead of northeast, as if the plane had rotated 90 degrees during its migration. I took extensive photographs and measurements, comparing them to my documentation from the first dive. It was definitely the same wreck, but the position change was undeniable. More disturbing was the condition of the lakebed around the aircraft. The sediment showed no signs of disturbance, No drag marks or impact traces that would indicate the wreck had been moved by external forces. "Elena, I need to ask you something," I said when I surfaced. "How long has the Coast Guard been tracking this wreck?" Her pause was longer than it should have been. "Blake, what I'm about to tell you is technically classified. We've been intermittently detecting this aircraft on sonar for the past 5 years. It appears at different locations across roughly a 10-square-mile area." She showed me a chart that mapped the aircraft's confirmed positions over time. The locations formed a rough pattern, a meandering path across the deepest part of Lake Superior's Minnesota waters, with sightings occurring every few months at different coordinates. During major storms, our surface radar occasionally picks up brief contacts that match the aircraft's signature, Elena continued. "Always during heavy weather, when visibility is zero and no other vessels are in the area. The contacts last less than 30 seconds before disappearing." I studied the tracking data. 17 confirmed sonar contacts over 5 years, each one in a different location but within the same general area of the lake. The aircraft appeared to be following some kind of route across the bottom, moving at irregular intervals, but maintaining a consistent general direction. "What's the geological composition of this area?" I asked. Elena consulted her charts. "Mostly clay sediments over limestone bedrock. Some areas of loose glacial till. The bottom topography is relatively flat, with occasional drop-offs where the bedrock changes elevation." Over the next 6 weeks, I participated in 4 more dive operations to document N7439D. Each time, the aircraft was in a new location, sometimes more than a mile from the previous sighting. The wreck itself never showed signs of damage from movement, no scoring or impact marks that would indicate dragging across the bottom. But I began noticing patterns in the lake bed composition at each site. The aircraft always appeared on areas of loose sediment rather than the typical hard-packed clay bottom of Lake Superior. Geological surveys of the area showed these sediment deposits were unstable, prone to shifting during seismic activity or major storm events. The most disturbing discovery came during my final dive to the wreck. As I documented the aircraft's position, I felt a subtle vibration through the water, not from surface activity, but from something moving beneath the lakebed itself. My depth gauge showed minor fluctuations, as if the bottom was rising and falling by inches. I collected sediment samples from around the aircraft and noticed that the material was much looser than typical Superior bottom composition. The samples contained unusual amounts of organic matter and showed signs of recent disturbance, despite the lack of any obvious cause for bottom disruption. When I surfaced, Elena was monitoring weather reports. A major storm system was approaching from the northwest, with predicted waves of 20 to 30 feet and sustained winds over 60 miles per hour. "We need to clear the area," she told me. "This storm is going to be a monster." As we headed for port, Elena received a radio call from Coast Guard operations. During the storm that night, radar had detected a surface contact matching N7439D's signature. The contact appeared for 28 seconds during the height of the storm, approximately 3 miles northeast of our dive site. The next morning, sonar surveys found no trace of the aircraft at any of the previously documented locations. N7439D had vanished from the lakebed entirely. I submitted my final report, recommending geological surveys of the area to determine if seismic activity or bottom instability could explain the aircraft's apparent movement. The report noted that Lake Superior's bottom composition in certain areas might be more dynamic than previously understood. 2 weeks later, I was transferred to search and rescue operations on the North Shore. Captain Morris said it was routine rotation, but the timing suggested otherwise. The N7439D file was classified and removed from active case status. Elena transferred to a Coast Guard station in Michigan 6 months later. Before she left, she told me that sonar had detected the aircraft one more time in deep water near Isle Royale. The wreck appeared to be continuing its migration across Lake Superior's bottom, following geological patterns that might take decades to understand. I still work Lake Superior, but I've never encountered N7439D again. Sometimes, during major storms when the waves are running 30 feet and the lake bed is being churned by forces that can move entire sections of bottom sediment, I wonder if that aircraft is still out there, carried by currents that flow through rock and clay instead of water. The lake keeps its dead in places that shift and change, following routes that exist beneath the bottom we think we know. The most dangerous thing about Jacob's Well isn't what's mapped, it's what the maps don't show anymore. I'm Samantha Pierce, and I've been a dive recovery specialist with the Hays County Sheriff's Office for 8 years. My jurisdiction covers the spring-fed swimming holes and cave systems of Central Texas, where clear water and limestone caves attract divers from around the world. Jacob's Well is the most dangerous of them all, a natural spring that drops 140 feet through a series of narrow chambers that have claimed more lives than any other diving site in Texas. The well sits in Wimberley, looking deceptively peaceful from the surface. Crystal clear water bubbles up from the limestone depths, creating a swimming hole that's been popular since the 1800s. But beneath the surface, the cave system becomes a maze of tight passages, false chambers, and restrictions that can trap even experienced cave divers. We've pulled 8 bodies from Jacob's Well in the past decade. Cave diving is technical work that requires specialized training, equipment, and procedures. Divers follow guidelines into the cave system, monitoring air supply and depth while navigating through spaces that can be barely wider than a human body. One wrong turn or equipment failure in the tight passages usually means death. We've got a missing diver at Jacob's Well. My supervisor, Captain Rodriguez, told me on a humid morning in June. 26-year-old male, experienced cave diver, went down yesterday afternoon and never surfaced. His dive buddy waited on the surface for 2 hours before calling it in. Missing diver calls at Jacob's Well were never good news. The cave system was complex enough that bodies could remain lost for months, trapped in side passages or deep chambers where recovery was nearly impossible. But every missing diver deserved a recovery attempt, regardless of the risks involved. "What's the last known position?" I asked. The dive buddy says they were exploring the second chamber, about 70 feet down. The missing diver, Marcus Webb, was attempting to penetrate deeper into the system when they lost visual contact. I loaded my technical diving gear and headed to Jacob's Well with my partner Rick Martinez and surface support coordinator Janet Phillips. The site was already secured by local deputies, with the swimming area closed to the public during the recovery operation. Gerald Knox, the cave system supervisor for the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, met us at the site with detailed maps of the known cave system. Gerald had been managing dive operations at Jacob's Well for 15 years and knew the cave system better than anyone. Marcus was an experienced diver, Gerald told me. Advanced cave certification, proper equipment, good safety record. But something's been bothering me about the recent incidents here. 3 fatalities in the past 18 months. All experienced divers. All lost in areas that should have been well within their capabilities. The maps showed Jacob's Well descending through 3 main chambers connected by narrow restrictions. The first chamber was relatively open, dropping to about 30 feet. The second chamber narrowed significantly, requiring divers to navigate through tight passages before opening into a larger space at 70 feet. The third chamber was the most dangerous, a deep, narrow shaft that dropped beyond safe diving limits. "When were these maps last updated?" I asked Gerald. "Officially, 2015. But I've been noticing discrepancies between the maps and what divers are reporting. Passages that should be there aren't, and new openings that aren't on any survey." I suited up for the initial search dive, using a full face mask with underwater communications and carrying enough mixed gas for an extended search at depth. Cave diving required redundant safety systems and careful air management, with enough reserve gas to handle emergencies and extended bottom time. The descent into Jacob's Well was routine until I reached the second chamber. Following the permanent guideline that marked the safe route through the cave system, I expected to find the chamber layout exactly as depicted on Gerald's maps. Instead, I discovered that the back wall of the chamber had changed significantly. Where the maps showed a solid limestone wall with the entrance to the third chamber on the right side, I found a new opening on the left that didn't appear on any survey. The passage was large enough for a diver to enter comfortably, and it showed signs of recent use scuff marks on the limestone where dive tanks had scraped against the walls. I followed the new passage for about 20 feet, staying within the safety limits for solo cave diving. The passage curved to the right and opened into a chamber that wasn't on any map, a space about the size of a small room with several additional passages leading off in different directions. At the back of the unmapped chamber, I found Marcus Webb. His body was wedged in a narrow restriction that appeared to dead end after about 10 feet. His equipment was intact, air supply exhausted, no signs of panic or struggle. He had simply followed the passage until it became too narrow to continue, then died, waiting for rescue that couldn't reach him. But the disturbing part was the evidence around his body: dive lights, pieces of equipment, and what appeared to be personal effects from other divers scattered throughout the unmapped chamber. Some of the equipment looked decades old, suggesting that divers had been getting lost in this area for years. "Gerald, I've found Marcus Webb," I reported through my communication system. "He's in an unmapped chamber system that doesn't appear on any of your surveys, and there's evidence of other fatalities here." "That's impossible, Samantha. The cave system has been thoroughly mapped. There are no unmapped chambers in the second chamber area." I photographed everything, documenting the new passages and the evidence of previous diving incidents. The limestone showed clear signs of recent geological activity: fresh fractures, loose rock, areas where the cave walls had shifted or collapsed to create new openings. When I surfaced, Gerald was waiting with obvious concern. "Samantha, what you're describing can't exist. I've personally surveyed every inch of that cave system." I showed him the underwater photographs. The evidence was clear: new passages, unmapped chambers, and signs that the cave system was actively changing its configuration through ongoing geological processes. "The limestone in this area is geologically active," Gerald admitted after reviewing my documentation. "We've had minor seismic activity, changes in the water table, and ongoing erosion from the spring flow, but I never thought it would create new passages fast enough to affect our maps." Over the next week, I worked with a team of cave cartographers to survey the new passages I'd discovered. What we found was disturbing. The cave system was changing much faster than anyone had realized. New passages were opening through limestone fractures, while existing passages were being closed by rockfalls and sediment shifts. The maps that divers relied on for navigation were becoming obsolete within months of being updated. Experienced cave divers were following routes that should have been safe according to the surveys, only to find themselves in unmapped sections of the cave system where rescue was impossible. "How many other dive sites have this problem?" I asked Gerald. "We're finding out that limestone cave systems throughout central Texas are more dynamic than we understood. Underground water flow, seismic activity, even major storms can alter cave passages faster than we can update the maps." The investigation revealed that 6 diving fatalities at Jacob's Well over the past 5 years had occurred in areas where the cave system had changed since the last official survey. Divers had been following established guidelines into passages that no longer led where the maps indicated, getting lost in newly formed chambers that didn't exist when the safety protocols were established. We recovered Marcus Webb's body and the remains of 2 other divers who had been lost in the unmapped sections of the cave system. The additional fatalities had never been reported because their bodies were in areas that rescue teams couldn't access using the existing cave maps. Gerald implemented new protocols, requiring real-time cave mapping before any diving operations, with electronic devices that could detect changes in passage configuration and warn divers when they were entering unmapped areas. But the technology was expensive and not widely available at other cave diving sites. I transferred to open water recovery operations 3 months later. The idea of diving in cave systems that could change their configuration between surveys was too dangerous to accept. But the Jacobs Well incident revealed a problem that affected cave diving sites throughout Texas and beyond. 6 months after the Webb recovery, Gerald called to tell me that geological surveys had confirmed active limestone dissolution throughout the Edwards Aquifer region. Cave systems were changing their configuration on timescales measured in months rather than decades, making static maps unreliable for navigation safety. We're having to close several cave diving sites until we can develop better real-time mapping technology, he told me. The ground itself is shifting faster than we can document it. I still work water recovery operations, but I've never returned to cave diving. The idea that the Earth itself can betray experienced divers by changing the rules between visits is more frightening than any equipment failure or human error. Marcus Webb died, following a map that was accurate when it was drawn, but fatal when he used it. He followed the guidelines exactly as trained, made all the right decisions according to established safety protocols, and died because the cave had quietly rearranged itself around passages that no longer led to safety. The limestone doesn't lie, but it doesn't stay still either. And in places like Jacobs Well, the ground beneath the water moves just fast enough to turn safe passages into tombs for divers who trusted maps that were obsolete before they got wet.